Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our risk management how-to workshop here on the Now platform. My name is Spencer Dixon, and I will be your solutions consultant for today, going over our integrated risk management solution and more specifically, our risk management application. So getting started here, let's go over a quick agenda for today's presentation. Now we're going to start with a brief overview of what risk management is. Next, we're going to dive into its features and how risk management really works. Next, we're going to jump into implementation and best practices for that implementation. And after that, follow up with a live demonstration. And lastly, go over some supplemental resources to get you guys on your feet and running with our risk management application. So starting off here with a brief overview of risk management as a whole. So within our Now platform and our risk management solution, we have a number of applications. Now, today we're going to be focusing specifically on risk. However, within our solution, we do include policy, compliance, audit, vendor risk, business continuity, and privacy applications. Now, while we are focusing specifically on risk, these applications all act and talk to each other on this Now platform. And so some of the key aspects that we're going to be looking at here in terms of the platform are going to be diving into our dashboard reporting or checking out things like orchestration and automation via our workflows here on the platform. Moving forward here, what exactly is a risk? So a risk is going to be a vulnerability that can be exploited by a threat. Now, some classic examples of risks are something like a global pandemic. What would happen if a global pandemic hit our organization, or things like a software attack or loss of availability, anything like that? Those are all examples of classic risks that are threats to organizations. Now, risk management essentially ensures that those risks that could potentially negatively impact your IT or business services are identified and treated. So some key roles that pertain to risk management are going to be our audit committees, our IT steering committees, risk officers, and pretty much all levels of management. Now, how does the risk management application work here on the Now platform? So we're going to begin by implementing your risk register and loading that into ServiceNow. So you can do that by either manually creating your own risk register or loading in data that you've previously had through something like an XML file. From there, we can look at those specific risks and begin assessing them. And so in these assessments, we can automate them to essentially look at your inherent and residual risk scores. And once we get those risk scores, we can then use that information to determine how we want to respond to it. So out of the box, we have 4 classic risk responses. Those are going to be acceptance, avoidance, mitigation, and transference of specific risks. However, we can implement any sort of response that you may need. Moving up on the screen here to our mitigating controls. So adding in mitigating controls, let's say we've already implemented compliance. We might have a number of different controls that we can add to help us mitigate particular risks. So from there, we can look at our control posture and, of course, monitor those assessments and residual risk scores. Moving down on the screen here, it's important that we continuously monitor our risks, and that's where our indicators come into play. So our indicators work to actively monitor those specific risks. So once they are realized, let's say a risk actually comes to fruition, we can go ahead and kick off an issue and respond to that as soon as possible via our active monitoring through our indicators. Lastly, reports and dashboards give us the view and information into the entire analytics within our platform in terms of looking at our risk posture across our entire organization. Moving forward here, I'd like to go over quickly run through our risk architecture here in the governance, risk, and compliance application. So, of course, looking down here at the bottom left here, compliance and policy management are not going to be included in the risk management application. However, these three all do interact with each other, and they interact with each other through these entity types right here. So our entity types are going to be how we categorize our risk policies and controls across the Now platform. So we can connect our different entity types through things like our CMDB or configuration management database. So in this way, I can have specific risks tied to things like specific assets, business applications, business services, etc. Now, let's say that I want to build my risk framework from scratch. We can start out over here within our risk framework, and this framework is going to act as a sort of hierarchy for our specific risks. Starting with our overall framework, we may want to look at something like operational risks. So underneath that, I might want to look at particular risk statements, right? So for example, risk of a pandemic, what we talked about earlier. So we can then tie that specific risk or risk statement to different entities. So let's say that we're going to have risk statements we're going to have that risk of a pandemic, that risk statement of a pandemic for each specific office location. So our LA office, our San Diego office, et cetera, et cetera. We can tie those to those different entity types to then categorize those risk statements. In this way, we can create different risks. Moving down here, with those specific risks, I can continuously monitor that status and outcome, that risk, to see whether or not it has occurred through our indicators. So these indicators are going to act as continuously monitoring devices to determine, did that risk actually happen? Has it come to fruition yet? And from there, let's say that that risk of the pandemic was realized, it can go ahead and kick off an issue. So a quick example of this, let's say that you have a risk that pertains to your website status. So you can have an indicator that monitors your specific website status. Let's say that your website has been down for 3 hours. That indicator can then realize that and fire off an issue and turn that risk from potential into actual, create that risk form so you can go about mitigating that. Next, moving down are our response tasks. So like I mentioned earlier, out of the box, we have mitigation, acceptance, transference, and avoidance. And based off of whatever response you may choose, you can kick off different workflows. For example, I can have different tasks assigned to different individuals to determine how I want to handle specific risks. And that's kind of the framework of our risk management application here within our GRC or integration or IRM application. Now let's go ahead and dive into some of the features within our risk management application. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at here is our risk overview dashboard. Now, similar to other dashboards on the Now platform, our risk overview dashboard is highly dynamic. And this means that I'm able to kind of dive into any of these sort of analytics as I may choose, which we're going to get onto in the demo later on. So here I'm able to take a look at my full risk posture as an organization, or see all the risks related to organizations and their score up at the top here. So here we're also able to tie each of these risks to specific entities. So I could see a specific report like this pertaining to a specific office location. If I'd like to, all I would have to do would be to select that entity and update accordingly. Moving down to the risk by category here, this is going to give us an overview of not only our risks in the entire organizations, but also broken down into different departments. So I'm able to see our operational risks, IT related risks, legal, financial, etc., giving you a lot of visibility into the risk posture of your organization as a whole. Now, this is one of many reports that come with ServiceNow, simply by turning on that risk management application plugin. Now, this is going to be a list of those base reports that you get by simply switching on that risk management plugin. Things to highlight here are, again, that risk by entity. We have high inherent risk, things like moderate residual risks, risk heat maps, a lot of reports that you can get by simply turning on that plugin. Moving on to our next feature, and that's going to be diving into our risk library and register. So this risk register is going to be a full list of all of your risks posed to your organization. Now, having a register like this on one platform is great because as you go in and change any aspect of your risk, it's going to dynamically update so you get real-time data, not only in the list view, but also in terms of the reports that we just saw. Once we go through and click on one of those risks, we can manage the full life cycle of that specific risk. And this is going to allow us to kick off a number of different workflows pertaining to this risk. Now, what do I mean by that? So this means that the life cycle of a risk on the Now platform starts when we draft it out. We can have specific risk identifications, so we can give ability to people throughout the organization to say, hey, I think I have a new risk on a particular project, and create a risk identification record. They can have someone within our own team prove that, or you can draft out a risk by having someone in your team create a new risk on the platform. And we'll run through that a little later today in our demonstration. As we draft out our risk, we'll then have inherent risk assessments, and this is where our workflows start to come into play. So when it's time to assess a particular risk, we'll automatically send out some sort of email or notification to that risk assessor, letting them know, hey, it's time to fill out this risk assessment. And that's kind of the power of the automation behind these workflows. Once that risk assessment is complete, we'll choose how to respond to it. Again, we have those 4 classic responses in terms of acceptance, mitigation, transference, and avoidance. Once we have responded, the risk will be reviewed, then we will be able to monitor it over time. Now, in that monitor phase, that's where those indicators are going to be extremely powerful because they're going to see things like when has my risk actually occurred and be able to notify and kick off those issues as needed. We can also retire our risks, and this is helpful in terms of moving into that audit stage and looking back on the risks that you may have closed previously. Now let's talk about assessing those risks. So risk assessments are going to act to identify and analyze those threats and vulnerabilities that might affect your organization. So out of the box, our risk assessments are going to ask things like, what's the probability of this risk occurring, alongside what's the impact that this risk has to our organization. Now, one frequently asked question that I get a lot is, how do I create my own questions to go into this risk assessment? And that is where our risk assessment designer comes into play. Now, our designer allows us to add or remove questions as we please, and even change the scale of those questions. So out of the box, what you're seeing here is going to be a scale of 1 to 5, ranging from very low to very high. However, that scale can be changed as needed. Next, moving on to our risk assessment process. Looking on the left here, this is going to provide an optimal strategy when designing these specific risk assessments. Starting at the top here, we're going to start with something holistic like our business service assessment. Moving down, we're going to then identify its supporting IT services. From there, we're going to branch down into what quantifies that specific service. In terms of this example, that's going to be our application and database. From there, we're going to break it down even further. And in terms of application, we're looking at things like our servers and data centers. And in terms of the database, we'll be looking at things like virtual servers, physical servers, and data centers. Now, that's going to allow us to identify all the components that make up this specific service that you're creating this risk for, and really allow for meaningful risk statements and an optimized strategy to quantify that risk as a whole. Now, risk scoring. There's 2 ways to look at risk scoring here on the Now platform, and that is in terms of quantitative or qualitative scoring. Now, quantitative scoring is going to be things like looking at your single loss expectancies or your annual rate of occurrence, or even things like your inherent average loss expectancy. While qualitative data is going to be looking at things on a scale of 1 to 5. So in terms of your inherent impact or inherent likelihood, it's going to go ahead and take that and scale it from very low to very high. Again, those scales can be modified as needed, so providing you a lot of options in terms of creating these assessments. Now, what we see a lot is assessments that use both qualitative and quantitative data. That seems to be pretty popular when utilizing these risk assessment design features. Now, when scoring data in a qualitative manner, this is going to allow us to create risk criteria. And this criteria is going to allow us to assign some sort of numerical value behind those risk scores. So let's say that something with a very low impact and a maximum value here is going to be equatable to around $1 million, or an extreme likelihood is relatable to about 100%. Here you're able to characterize those scores and modify them to meet your needs in terms of those specific risk assessments. Now, once we have the ability to assess our different risks, we might want to create a risk hierarchy. So this is where we can utilize our GRC workbench. So here what we're doing is looking at a hierarchy of our different risks. Here we have our risk framework, then we're going to have our particular risk statements, and lastly followed by our specific risks down here. So here we're also able to link with something like our CMDB, so we can look at things like our relationships between our different applications and our associated risks. Here we can see our risk management architecture that we addressed a little earlier, just a little bit more visual representation. So starting out here, we have our overall risk framework. Then we have our risk statements. So let's say that we're taking a look at something like an operational risk, and that operational risk statement may pertain to the risk of an earthquake. So I might have different control objectives from compliance that tie into this particular risk statement. Maybe that means I want to have certain disaster recovery plans in place for my San Francisco office, for example. We may also want to have specific risk indicator templates that's tied to that specific risk statement as well. Also, underneath this specific risk statement, I have that risk. So that would be the risk of an earthquake in our San Diego office, LA office, San Francisco, for example, et cetera, et cetera. Then I have those specific indicators looking out for that risk that occurred. Now, let's say that we accept the risk of an earthquake hitting. There's nothing we can really do to avoid it. We have risk response tasks and mitigation plans ready with specific controls in place to help remediate that risk as soon as possible. So, for example, we accept the earthquake is going to happen. We can at least be ready to clean it up after it occurs. And that's where our risk response tasks come into play. Now, we can also tie to risk events, and these risk events can be any kind of risk that isn't related to IT. Up to you how you want to differentiate these risks and these risk events here on the Now platform. Now, when we're talking about those risk statements, here's a typical example of something that we see quite frequently. So out of the box, we have 3 risk statements. In this specific screenshot, that's going to be loss of confidentiality down here, but we also have loss of integrity and loss of availability. Now, these risk statements can be extremely helpful in linking and automating the creation of risks by tying these specific risk statements to business applications. So I can tie these statements to, let's say, every business application that I have to automatically build out my risk register. Now, next here, we're looking at the parts of a risk statement and what's on that form. Some common things like name, framework, issue group, description. However, we also have things like different categories alongside inherent and residual SLEs and AROs. Now, underneath those risk statements lies our specific risks. So here we can see a typical risk where we can monitor the entire life cycle of that risk. Alongside this, we can see that we have a loss of confidentiality risk tied to our specific entity type. In this case, that's going to be a piece of software here, as well as a short description. And here we have the different parts of a risk as well. Notice we also have those common things, but some things I'd like to highlight are, again, that entity type that's going to prove to be pretty powerful in terms of categorizing your specific risks. We also have things like our status of the risk that depends on the life cycle, alongside our risk scoring. Now, mentioning that risk scoring, here's what it looks like on a record format. So we can see that our inherent score down here is going to be a 4, and that's going to go ahead and affect our calculated ALEs alongside taking into consideration that calculated score. So talking about that qualitative data here and seeing it visually on this form. Now, if I want to track all the details related to my risk status and journey, I can do so in this activity journal down here. So this journal is going to allow us to show all the changes that happen on that risk. So anything from work notes to version history, etc., being pretty powerful in terms of having all of your notes in one central location. Now let's go ahead and start talking about how we're able to respond to our risks. So again, on that Now platform, a risk can be mitigated, accepted, avoided, or transferred. And then we can create different workflows based off of those responses. So for example, let's say a risk is accepted. We may need to then create a plan, have that plan be approved, reviewed, etc., etc. So here we can see exactly what that looks like and how these risks can be determined following a formal risk assessment. This is how we're really going to look into that residual risk. Now, in practice, what we're going to do is have different actions based off the different risk responses that we choose. So here we can see mitigate is going to pertain to deploying those mitigating controls. Accepting that risk is going to pertain to assigning a business owner and having them understand and sign off on that risk. Avoiding the risk is going to need the action of rejecting the risk and deploying measures to avoid it. Lastly, transferring that risk is going to essentially transfer the risk to another party or entity so it can be dealt with there. Now we have a number of different workflows that are kicked off based off which response you choose. So here we can see how the following acceptance, avoidance, mitigation, and transfer go ahead and change the state, have different approval processes, and create different tasks. Now that we've talked about what a risk is, those specific statements, frameworks, and the architecture that it all lies upon, let's talk about best practice in terms of implementation. So we have a number of keys to deployment success. First thing that we're going to do is determine our business case so we know what outcomes we're looking for. So for example, today's outcome could be having that risk register up and running so I can create new risks and risk statements so that I have a hierarchy of risks built out and ready to go. Now, defining success criteria as well. So maybe we're able to assess all our different risks and have that register in place. So planning for adoption is something we're going to take into consideration during this stage. So before we are fully operational, this could be things like changing our branding on your instance or aligning our strategy and culture. Now, moving over on the slide here into the preparation phase, this is where we have a lot of training and fundamentals courses already set up for you guys to take. So I would highly recommend ServiceNow and GRC fundamentals training, as this provides a pretty thorough understanding of the Now platform, as well as our GRC solution framework. And essentially, it provides information on how to successfully manage and deploy those services on customer instances. Alongside this, we want to make sure that we're identifying a product owner to determine who we're giving the admin capability to in this preparation phase. Moving on to the planning phase here, this is where we are going to determine a team that will own and maintain our GRC solution. So in this particular phase, this is where we're taking a look at stakeholders as well and defining a timeline and plan for testing and implementation. Moving forward into the collaboration phase, this is going to be where we're making sure that all of our teams are on the same page. So our compliance team, our risk, our policy management, audit, etc. These teams are all going to be talking to each other and getting on the same page in terms of our GRC solution. Lastly, going over the handover phase here, this is where we're going to get up and running with that solution and application. We're going to have process guides to make sure our users know how to use the GRC product successfully within that Now platform. Now we have a number of different stages of maturity when it comes to implementation. Starting out in this manual phase, our goal is to get people to basic and repeatable as soon as possible. So this means that taking into consideration that one particular use case that causes the most headache, i.e. something like faulty Excel sheets, again, looking at that one use case, implementing, and then getting value quickly. So then we can start expanding into adding policies to ServiceNow, adding in compliance requirements. Maybe we're taking a look at something like SOX, for example. And as we keep building throughout our stages of maturity, we're able to gain more functionality, like audits becoming easier and realizing that, hey, I didn't need to email 1 million people to make sure that my risk assessments are completed. This is where we move into that manage and optimize stages. Now, the last thing that we're going to do here before jumping into our live demonstration is taking a look at our specific risk roles. So starting off, we have those 3 categories at the top here, our risk admin, risk user, and risk manager. So our admin is going to be able to perform everything that a GRC admin or regular admin would do, however, strictly scoped to this GRC application. So here they're able to delete risk frameworks, statements, specific risks, modify admin properties, and modify risk criteria. Now, a risk user is going to be able to perform everything that a typical user can, however, again, just scope to this GRC platform, and they will be assigned to specific risks. Now, risk managers are going to be able to, again, perform everything that a manager would do, however, just scoped to this GRC application. Here, they're able to create risk frameworks, risk statements, and create specific risks. Now here, moving forward, our risk reader is going to have read-only access to the risk application and modules pertaining to that specific application. And they can also be assigned specific risks here. Now, again, looking into our risk user, this is going to contain the reader and user roles. In addition to all the inherent permissions, the risk user can view entity types, entities, risks, and remediation tasks. And the risk users can be assigned risks that have read-only access to the policy and compliance management applications as well. Now, our assessment creators are going to be able to do just that. They're going to be able to create assessments, create updates to those assessments, and publish risk assessments. They're also going to contain that reader and user role. Next, our risk manager is going to be able to, again, create risk frameworks, statements, and specific risks, alongside having those reader, user, and manager roles scoped in that GRC application. Lastly, diving a little bit deeper into our admin, again, highlighting the fact that they are able to have the permissions pertaining to deleting risk frameworks, risk statements, and risks, and be able to modify those admin properties and criteria. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into a live demonstration where I can show you what we just talked about. Alrighty, now that we've talked about what a risk is, statements, framework, architecture, etc., alongside implementation and specific roles pertaining to that risk application, let's go ahead and jump into a live demonstration where I can go ahead and show you some of the features that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So, jumping right on in here, first thing I want to show you is how to activate that risk application or risk management plugin here on the Now platform. So I just went ahead and logged in as myself and given myself that GRC admin capabilities. And what I'm going to do here is filter through up at the top, go to the all section, simply type in plugins, system definition plugins, and that's going to take me to this space right here. From here, I'm going to go ahead and type in GRC risk management, and you can see that I already have this plugin installed, but this is going to be the application that we've been highlighting today. And simply come to this portal, install this, give your system a little bit of time to get that up and running, and then we will be able to jump into our application features. From here, now that we have the features updated and on our Now platform, we can filter back to this all section and simply type in risk And this is going to allow us to see everything pertaining to that specific risk management application. So as you notice on the left here, everything is alphabetized. So if we want to check out something like our risk register, we're going to have to scroll all the way down to the bottom. So as we can see here, these are all of our application features. We can see the risk register here, our risk assessments, grouped assessments, alongside some things that we talked about, like our risk library, our GRC workbench, again, all within the Now platform here. Already taking that information into account, seeing all the features that we have here, let's go ahead and dive into our risk register and see how we can either import a new risk register or create risks here on the Now platform. So underneath this risk register category, we're going to go ahead and jump into all risks. And this is going to take us to, again, that risk register and the advanced view of all of our risks here on the Now platform. Now, if we want to create a new risk, we can simply come over to this new button over here, click it, and just like that, we will have our new risk form here up and running. Some things to highlight, again, simple stuff like the name description, alongside something like our category and the entity type over here that we will jump into a little bit later in our demonstration. We can also see that the timeline up here highlights all of the different phases. So right now it's in the draft phase. However, if we go ahead and kick it off, submit it, it's going to go into the assess phase, so on and so forth. Now, what if I want to submit a risk register that I currently already have on something like an Excel file? To import a file like that, all we have to do is simply come up to this top banner right here, right click, and right away we're greeted with our import selection. Here we can either insert new data or update new data. It's going to ask if we want to create an Excel template to enter this data, and we can also utilize templates that we have already chosen. From here, we can go ahead and choose our specific file and upload it. It is as simple as that. Alrighty, once we get all those risks updated into our register and imported, we can go ahead and actually filter through the information that's on this risk register. So let's say we want to change what we're able to see here. We can simply come to this settings cog over here in the right top corner. And from here, we're able to select things that we want to see and maybe take away some of the things we don't. So let's say that we want to see the risks that are active, or the risks that are, or the specific risk class, something of that nature. Let's say we want to put the active status next to our owning group. From there, we can go ahead and filter those selections. And right away, we're able to see all the risks that are active here next to that owning group alongside the class that they are in. It's pretty simple to filter through the data and see what you want to see when you want to see it. So now, alongside being able to filter the data that we see on this page, we're also able to filter through our risks as well. So at the bottom here, you can see that I have around 12,000 risks. It's going to be a little bit tedious scrolling through to try to find something. So in order to filter through, I can come up here to the filter icon. And let's say that today I want to filter by state. So I'm going to go ahead and select that state is, and I want to check out the ones that are actually in the monitor phase. From there, I can run this filter, and just like that, I'm able to filter down to 400 or so out of that 12,000 that, again, are in that monitor state. So pretty simple to filter through all of your risks within your risk register. Again, you are able to see whatever you want to see when you want to see it. Again, it's pretty simple to be able to filter out and see what you want to see in an easy manner. Now that we have gone through importing our data into our risk register alongside filtering and navigating through this register, let's go ahead and check out our risk frameworks. So to do so, go back to this all section, and we're going to go ahead and type in risk framework. Right away, it populates underneath our risk library. And from here, we're able to see all the frameworks that are on our current platform. So we have everything from corporate risks to departmental, again, business service, third party, alongside a lot of these specific ones like NIST or anything like that. So this is going to be where you're able to see the ones that are already on the system alongside the ones that you may populate yourself as well. To create a new risk framework, all we got to do is come over here to this new tab, similar to those risks. And let's say that I want to create a risk framework relating to public health. So let's call this public health risks. I'm going to go ahead and save. Now, I do recommend saving instead of submitting. Submitting is going to take you back to that risk framework, while saving is going to keep you on the page. And just like that, we are able to see what pops up here. So we're able to check out our entity types as well as risk statements that we can link this to. So in terms of entity types, we can create new ones or we can edit pre-existing ones. If we go ahead and click edit here, it's going to give us a list of those entity types that we already have within that Now platform. So these are all coming from the CMDB, and these are going to populate when you do link that CMDB. So let's say that I want to link my public health risks framework to something like our data centers or our company or business applications. We can go ahead and filter that over and tie in that entity type to, again, then categorize our risk framework. Alongside adding those entity types, more importantly, we are able to add our risk statements. So similarly, we're able to create new ones or add pre-existing ones that we may have. For the sake of today's demo purpose, let's go ahead and create a new risk statement. And again, this is pertaining to that health risk that we have, our overarching health risk. So let's call this one risk of a pandemic. From here, I can also check out and create parent or child risks, give it a description, categorize it, give it an issue group. These are going to be our out-of-the-box categories. In terms of this specific risk, we're going to go ahead and say that this is operational. And again, we're going to save this as opposed to submitting it so we can stay on this form. Now, after saving this, we're able to see what populates underneath, and that's going to be pertaining to adding different entity types. In this section, we can even add our different risks here. So link the different risks that we may have to this specific statement. Check out our indicator templates, as well as if we want to link this to anything in particular, like a website or a specific data center, we can do so in these information objects. And this is going to tie in directly with our CMDB to help relate certain aspects and applications to this specific risk statement. Now that we have our specific risk statement in place, let's go ahead and add a risk to this risk statement. So we can navigate down to this risk category down here, filter in, select the new tab, and that's going to bring up our risk form here. So we can input basic stuff like our name and description, and then again, more complicated stuff like tying in that entity type or giving it an owning group. So for the sake of this demo, let's go ahead and name this risk pandemic and tie it to our information technology, our IT sector. So we want to be able to monitor our information technology in the unlikely event of a pandemic here. We're going to tie it to that IT group. We can also assign owning groups or owners, and these owning groups are going to be created by that GRC admin as well. So doing so, giving it what it needs, I will go ahead, save it. Now, after saving this record, we are able to move it into the assess phase. And in doing so, we're able to select an assessor. In this case, we'll select someone random like Andrew Taylor. He's on the risk board, alongside the amount of days that it has to be done until it's overdue. From here, we can submit it, and just like that, our assessment is sent out to the person that needs to assess it, alongside giving them the specific timeline. In this case, it was 5 days for them to complete that specific assessment. Now that we went ahead and sent that risk assessment out to who it needed to go to, let's go ahead and check out what this risk assessment looks like within the Now platform. So in order to do so, we can go back to this all category and type in assessment types. And underneath the risk here, you can see that I have it favorited by simply selecting the star icon. After navigating to this assessment types page, we're going to be greeted by a table with all of our risk assessments that we have on the Now platform. So in this specific instance, I have a lot of assessments that are already loaded in here. However, this is going to show you the list of all of your assessments that you have currently within your organization. Now, let's say that I wanted to create a new assessment. We can go ahead and create one from this new button, or we can jump into the assessment designer to take a look under the hood of how we can edit or create new assessments. Now, jumping into this risk assessment designer, here's where we can add new questions, categories, or controls in a drag and drop format. So let's go ahead and name our new assessment. We'll go ahead and call it Pandemic Risk Assessment. And let's say we want to have a question relating to a numerical scale. We can go ahead and drag and drop from our controls template over here right into that new category. And we can go ahead and name this something like likelihood or something like that. From there, we can go ahead and add it in, add a new numerical scale, anything like that. So our risk assessment designer is going to be a great template for you to not only edit and configure old or pre-existing risk assessments, but alongside create new ones in an easy manner. Now that we've checked out our risk assessment designer, let's go ahead and jump into one of these risk assessments that's out of the box or pre-configured on the platform. So we scroll down to our simple risk assessment down here and jump into this record. We're able to see name, assessment duration, the table that it's pertaining to, alongside our scale factor and all the details pertaining to the specific risk assessment. Down here within our related links, we're able to see our specific metric categories. So in this particular instance, it's going to be inherent and residual risk. And if we open up one of these risks, we're able to see all of the questions that are tied to this specific metric. Now, some of these questions are going to be related to things like health and safety, financials, reputation, the specific impact of the employer. And one thing I want to highlight over here is our weights. So let's say that we are more focused on the financial impact of our specific inherent risk. We can go ahead and weight this specific question higher, and that's going to affect our overall risk score for our inherent risk differently. So again, we're able to assign different weights to kind of categorize and prioritize which questions and which specific areas that we are most interested in when assessing our risks. Now that I was able to show you a couple features here on the Now platform relating to our risk register, then jumping into specific frameworks, diving a little bit deeper into risk statements and specific risks and tying all three of those together. And lastly, diving through our risk assessment designer and checking out our out-of-the-box risk assessments. Let's go ahead and jump back into those slides so I can hopefully provide you guys with a little bit more supplemental materials to get you guys up and running. Now, jumping into some of these supplemental resources, I went ahead and laid out some resources in regards to gaining process insights, differences in terminology, understanding post-go live support efforts, alongside configuration insights. Now, within these specific categories, I would highly recommend that you guys navigate down to these specific links, as this is going to be links to supporting documentation and materials on our Now Docs site. So this is going to be a great resource for answering any sort of questions you guys may have post-presentation, alongside jumping into our community forums. Those are going to be a great way to answer questions as well. And on top of those resources, if you guys do have any specific questions that you can't answer via this presentation or the documents provided, do not hesitate to reach out to your account teams. They're going to be great in being able to answer any sort of questions or provide any sort of material that you guys may need. With that being said, I want to thank you guys for tuning in to today's presentation and on going over our GRC risk management implementation and solution. Hopefully you guys were able to gain a little bit of insight into the implementation and some of the features within our risk management application. With that being said, thank you guys once again and have a great rest of your day.